Following a number of conversations we held with our customers around sanctions, sanction screening and risk assessments specifically on sanctions, we met up with Dr Alessia Carbone from the Sanctions Monitoring Board to precisely address these questions. So please do join us in this discussion together with Alex and myself and Dr Alessia Carbone.
Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's discussion. From our end, there is Ariane and myself from Risk Consulting Advisory, and with us is Dr Alessia Carbone, who is currently serving as the Director for Transnational Threats and Sanctions at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Tourism, and was also the Secretary to the Sanctions Monitoring Board. Naturally, that gives away the subject that we're going to discuss today, which is sanctions and sanction risk. The threats of sanctions and the importance of sanction risk has increased over the last few years, of course, because of geopolitical tensions. And we've also seen lately changes in regulation and legislation that is going to take place in Malta. And that's exactly what we wanted to focus about, because not only from a legal perspective, but the alignment with sanctions and sanction requirements is also an important part of financial crime risk assessment.
Yes, thanks Alex and welcome Alessia. And last November there was an update to the legislative framework, the National Interest Enabling Powers Act. And this was very welcomed by the industry, and we felt it was necessary as well. So it came at a very, very good time. But from the SMB's perspective, what were those gaps or challenges that in the previous framework now you wanted to address with this update?
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. Well, actually, our law wasn't that old. It was enacted in 2018 with some additional amendments in the years to follow. However, given the rapid changing in the sanctions environment, there was a need to update the law. This update didn't come only from the fact that we needed to do certain transpositions. We had the transposition of the directive on the criminalization of restrictive measures, because in the EU it wasn't always a criminal offense, the violation of sanctions. Just to clarify, in Malta that was always a criminal offense, but obviously it wasn't the same in other EU jurisdictions. We had also the instant payment regulation and the transfer of funds regulations that had to be transposed into law. And when we started doing the drafting to transpose these legislative amendments, we saw that it's going to be a bit of a hodgepodge and very difficult to understand. And therefore, we thought that it would be more useful to overhaul the law and include also certain gaps that we had identified. We made sure that, for example, all the definitions are aligned to those of the EU regulations. We increased the membership of the SMB, whereby we included, for example, the Malta Business Registry, the Malta Gaming Authority, the Organization for Voluntary Organizations, and also other entities that we had also worked with over the past years, including Comunità Malta and Residency Malta.
Okay.
But also we realized that, for example, we had gaps in the sense that, for example, once we had several containers getting caught here with a large amount of vodka. These obviously cause a problem for us in terms of space and time and resources that are being involved to maintain the assets in their correct form. And therefore we said we need to have options in transferring these into fiat and to ensure that the money is remaining frozen into bank accounts. So we gave that possibility not only for us, but also for the private sector if that is needed. We also included the possibility of a firewall, whereby if an individual is sanctioned, not all the company would be sanctioned, in order to safeguard the economical and social purposes of such companies. And we also included the deferred prosecution agreement, which is another good tool to also ensure that enforcement is there. And whilst we enumerated the crimes and with the correspondent penalties related thereto, which are very high, I must say, both in terms of a legal person or a natural person, And here I also would like to make the emphasis that even the directors, company secretaries, or management could be held liable for, in their own personal capacity, for actions that are done by a legal entity. We also have the possibility of dealing with certain crimes which have a threshold of €10,000 in an administrative manner. And this, in line with the directive, would ensure that there is additional enforcement from our side when it comes to sanctions.
So clearly there was a lot of thought behind these changes, in that looking at the geopolitical situation and how it's impacting obviously our sanctions regime locally, looking at the EU directives and any transpositions which required to be done from a local perspective, but also then looking at, listen, what needs to be changed locally so that we're more effective when it comes to sanctions. And from what I understand, this takes a lot of time and effort to be able to do so. So there was a lot happening in the background which maybe we're not aware of.
Indeed, it was a long process, and we ensured that there were public consultations as well in order not to shock the sectors, to kind of get everyone on board, because we ultimately depend on the private sector as the first gatekeepers of sanctions enforcement.
So we've seen the gaps, we've seen the changes, and we understand that the Sanctions Monitoring Board will be also issuing guidance in this regard for the entities that need to abide with these changes. And if we could get some insight into what this guidance is going to look like, and how proportionality is going to be considered, and also perhaps clarification of whether the entities that need to abide with these changes are those which fall within the remit of and need to abide with AML, CFT requirements, or whether the net is actually wider.
So I would like to start from the last question that you posed. We need to make clear that sanctions are applicable to everyone, irrespective whether you are an obliged entity or not a non-obliged entity. So the fact that you have to adhere with sanctions is applicable to all. Now, the difference being that the obliged entities, those that are listed in Schedule 1 of the law, they have the additional obligations of Article 32 of the law, which are how effective is your sanctions monitoring framework within your entity. So these were expanded a bit. These are X76, what we used to call X76, and they are expanded a bit, and we try to clarify who you need to verify and identify within your customs framework, what you need to have in your internal policies and procedures, when do you need to report to the Sanctions Monitoring Board, when do you need to do your screening. So these are having a systems in place. Really, they only relate to having a systems in place, not whether you are to adhere or not to sanctions. The adherence is there for everyone. And you mentioned rightly so that we will be issuing some guidance. The guidance is very long, I must say. And one amendment that we did to the law is that such guidance that is issued by the SMB has to be abided by. It has the force of law. It is legally binding, unlike what was previously there. And just like the implementing procedures of the FIAU, we will be issuing guidance on the obligations and that obliged entities, those entities that are listed in Schedule 1, have when it comes to Article 32, the article that obliges those entities to have systems in place. This also includes the having of a risk assessment and proliferation financing assessment as well, risk assessment. So this is another change that needs to be inbuilt in the systems that are ongoing for the obliged entities. But that is something that I wanted to underline, that sanctions are there for everyone. It is just this difference that when it comes to obliged entities, they will be supervised by the supervisory authorities, FIU and GA and MFSA, who then report back to us in terms of sanctions compliance.
Very good. So sanctions and binding with sanction regulations and legislation casts a wider net than obliged entities, that is, those entities which are falling within the remit of the AML-CFT framework. And we understand that you're going to prioritize those when it comes to the guidance that will be issued. Was there any, what was the rationale behind this?
So we decided to start with the obliged entities because obviously those are the ones that are supervised. And therefore we need to make sure that those have the appropriate guidance when it comes to showing what they are doing in terms of their frameworks. But this doesn't mean that we will not issue guidance for the non-obliged entities, because obviously there are risks related specifically to non-obliged entities. Particularly, I mentioned the importers, exporters, for example, who have significant risks when it comes to sanctions legislation. And obviously, we want to make sure that those are also in line, but according to the law, they are not supervised, as are the obliged entities, Schedule 1 operators, as we call them under the law, which required urgent guidance because they are obviously being supervised.
Yeah. I think something which the obliged entities are thinking about is this. Nowadays, there is the financial crime umbrella in most organizations and with most subject persons. That, you know, there's AML, sanctions, risks, fraud. So they're bringing in the different aspects. And obviously, there is certain information which is collected for all of these aspects. So to have less duplication, to be more efficient. So having this separation sometimes of the sanctions from this, from the AML, sometimes is seen as maybe too rigid. And we can make use of that information also for sanctions. How do you see it from an SMB perspective to make use of the information that we have and be more efficient also, you know, looking at financial crime holistically?
Indeed, this is something that we try to take into consideration, particularly with our colleagues from the FIU, to ensure that even when we drafted the law and the guidance, we do not impose additional unnecessary checks or verification processes. So we try to, as much as possible, align the guidance with that, what is issued by the FIU. However, obviously, just because you are AML compliant doesn't mean that you are sanctioned compliance, because obviously there are these there are significant differences actually between the two frameworks. Want to mention that we always get asked, what is this ownership? Why are you speaking of the 50% whilst AML speaks of the 25%? Why do you kind of make this difference? And obviously, I think the trickier part comes when you have aggregate ownership.
Yes.
Control is obviously something that needs to be ensured also from an AML perspective, but also there is the control part. And here, we always suggest that when you do your sanctions assessments, when it comes to new clients, for example, onboarding new clients, don't be afraid to do the assessment and also to document it and show how you came to your conclusion. Yes. Because that will obviously show that you have taken all the precautions necessary. Obviously, if you are presented with false documentation, you cannot do otherwise. But you have taken all the precautions necessary and you did your assessment.
Because the aggregate, as you mentioned, is I think one of the areas where it could be slightly different to the AML, because then it can, or you would need perhaps to look also at individuals who hold less than 25%. So the 50% is not necessarily, you know, covering all your AML beneficial owners, let's put it that way. So yes, there are those differences as long as we document and you know, what this assessment carried out for the sanctions, that is what is important then.
Indeed, and it is actually a known circumvention technique to reduce the shareholding below certain thresholds to make sure that you are not caught even by the AML checks. So obviously you would need to take this into consideration when dealing with your clients. But the most important thing is that you actually write or document what your assessment was at the time.
At a new level, Alessia, we're saying that the sanctions risks is also being brought in under AMLA, also within the AML kind of umbrella. There's, also the regulation talking about it. We've seen also in some of the RTS's mention of that. So how are we looking at it from a local perspective, given these changes at an EU level?
Yes, we have been in close coordination with our FIU as well on this. Of course, there have been certain aspects which have been included under the umbrella of AMLA. However, we need to remember the raison d'etre of sanctions, and these are political tools. And therefore, ultimately, it's a member state prerogative, and the national competence always remains. And therefore, it is up to us to see how to enforce and implement sanctions within our jurisdiction. And this is something that we are still working on, obviously bearing in mind all the EU regulations that are coming, still incoming, and they never cease to amaze us. So it is something that we are still considering, but obviously, ultimately, it is a member state.
Yes, always go back to the purpose. Never forget the reason why we're doing it.
Indeed.
Certainly, among the changes that you mentioned is the requirement to put in place a sanctions risk assessment. In this regard, what kind of and what level of detail is the Sanctions Monitoring Board expecting, and how does proportionality come into play here?
Yes, of course, this is all very subjective because it all depends on the different business model that the entity has, and obviously the risks are divergent from one entity to the next. This is not all in terms of customers, it's in terms of jurisdiction of where they operate, also in terms of the business product, and therefore it is very subjective in the sense that it needs to be tailored specifically to that entity. You need to understand the overall business that you are conducting, and also to include that within your business risk assessment that you are already doing, or you can have it as a standalone. We are not kind of after a standalone or one that is incorporated. It is what suits your business best. However, you need to show, if you're going to incorporate it in the overall assessment, that you have actually done a sanctions risk assessment, that you have incorporated sanctions into your methodology, and that you are able to extrapolate that and show it to the supervisory authorities when you are supervised. However, there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, and therefore proportionality plays a huge part in this overall risk assessment that needs to be done.
Very similarly, right, to what we had when we had to do business risk assessments for the first time. There were a lot of questions about how detailed would we have to go into, etc. I think the underlying message here is, as long as it is sufficient and appropriate to identify and assess and then manage sanctions risk within your business, then that is those are the ingredients. And there's no like one size fits all.
Indeed, because every business is different. We know that the majority of businesses here are SMEs, but there are very small SMEs and there are a bit larger SMEs with different risk and different exposures. So it would be very frivolous for me to say this is the risk assessment that you need to do. It all depends on your type of business and the size and the magnitude of the business and your exposure.
Very good. So we'll soon be wrapping up this discussion today, but we wanted to ask you one last question to give our listeners your key insights looking in the future, given these changes that we're looking at, and also the change in geopolitical environment. What is a key matter that they should be looking at?
So for us, unfortunately, the geopolitical tensions will likely be there for a number of months, over possibly years, and therefore it's important to always be kept abreast of all the developments that are going on. Unfortunately, the voluminous nature of sanctions doesn't help, but we try to do our best to help the industry with our newsletter and to keep abreast of all the updates that are being done, and not to be afraid to do the assessment yourself, and also to seek legal counsel when you do not arrive to that assessment by yourself. We are there also to guide, but obviously we encourage obliged entities and other entities to seek legal counsel, because there is a need to adhere to sanctions and to make sure that you are not in breach of sanctions, because these carry significant risks of criminal penalties and also a risk to the overall jurisdiction. You are, after all, the gatekeepers of our jurisdiction, and we count on you to adhere to sanctions as much as possible.
Yes, indeed. So we come to a close of this really interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Alessia, for being here with us. We can obviously see that sanctions go beyond the screening nowadays. I think we all know that by now. We also looked at the changes and the background behind those changes, and also a sneak peek on what's coming next around the guidance and what to expect. So we'll be looking forward to seeing the guidance, which I'm sure will help us along the way. And thank you very much once again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.